I know I've made mention of Scum games having a easily identifiable look and feel. You know, verb grid down the side, inventory next to it, and all the graphical prettiness up the top. And that worked pretty well without much need for an overhaul. There was the odd attempt to stretch the engine out a little bit. Monkey Island utilised its dialogue trees for insult sword fighting, Fate of Atlantis had branching paths based on player choice, Sam & Max did its best impression of a Sierra game interface for some reason. But there's one game which is a clear odd one out, so much so that it's barely recognisable as a Scum game at all. You want to know more about it? Ask me about Loom. Quick plot dump first of all. Loom tells the tale of Bobbin Fredbear, a young man born into the guild of weavers but forbidden from practising their magic by the elders. Yet, one of their kind, a woman named Hetchel, educates Bobbin anyway. The elders find out about this and attempt to enact the punishment by turning her into a swan, which sounds pretty sweet to be honest, but they only manage to turn her into an egg. As they're pondering what went wrong, a swan bursts in and turns the elders themselves into swans. Bobbin, who is hiding off to the side of the Great Loom, watches as the elders take their new bird forms through the rift while cursing his name. Bobbin picks up the magic stick one of the elders was wielding and uses it to help open Hetchel's egg. Explaining that Bobbin was feared from birth, which is why the elders prevented him from learning their weaving way, she tells him to find the rest of the swans and follows the elders through the rift. Magic stick in tow, Bobbin sets off to find the weavers and hopefully find out just what in the fuck. On the way, you'll travel across the sea, meet invisible shepherds, talk to a pyrophobic dragon, you know, typical weaver shit.
Can't take your eyes off me, can you?
For a game that rallied so hard against an established style, Loom was in fact only the fourth game to make use of the Scum engine we all know and love today. What makes Loom different is that there's no verbs or inventory whatsoever. You can double click on objects or people to examine or talk to them, but that's it. Instead, you use the magic stick, boringly it's actually called a distaff, to cast spells known as drafts, which are made up of 4 notes each. As you progress, you learn more drafts and unlock higher notes on the distaff with which to cast said drafts. And no, you can't short-circuit the game by attempting to cast drafts you haven't learned yet. You can also cast certain drafts backwards for an opposite effect. For example, you learn a draft that dyes things green. Playing that draft backwards returns the object to its original colour. For a skill that's essential to progressing in the game, it's either not explained at all or I completely missed it. I do like the simple touch that some of the drafts are palindromes, meaning that their effects can't be reversed. It's much cleaner than the kind of arbitrary error message you might see in other titles. Plus, you can pretend you're in an episode of Nightmare trying to dispel one of Mordred's magical yarns, so that's pretty cool, if you grew up in 90s Britain. Anyway, if you want a real challenge, the expert mode takes the letter scale away, so you have to identify and play the notes by ear. Haha, no. As I've said, you find more drafts as you go along, but it's up to you to keep track of them, so if you're going to play this, get a notepad and pen ready or play it windowed with your favourite text editor open off to one side. I'm putting this down to minimalism personally, which makes it fit in with the rest of the tone. A seemingly rich lore with an atmospheric and genuinely mysterious environment to go with it. You keep playing to find out more about the world and your place in these strange events. Having a big ass list of drafts pop up in front of you could well break that engagement. Unfortunately, the game ends pretty quickly. It's barely longer than Blazing Dragons. The fact that you essentially have one item does prevent a fair bit of backtracking, although the small environments and very linear nature of the game mean that's not really an issue in the first place. Now, since Loom is so different from all its peers, I've put together 5 quick tips in case you decide to try it out, just to help you acclimatise to the whole thing. 1. Write down the drafts somewhere safe. Seriously, you won't remember them all and the game randomises the notes each time. If you don't write them down, you will need to start again. Number 2. Double click on any notable item you see just in case it can teach you a new draft. Number 3. Name the drafts as you make a note of them, and if it's not a palindrome, name it by what you can do if possible. That way you'll bear in mind what the opposite effect is in case you need it. Number 4. You have to cast drafts on things, so click the thing you want to cast a draft on first. Once that thing's name appears, then you can cast the draft. Number 5. Use a walkthrough for this maze. There's no shame in this, it's just a bloody maze. There's so much more that I could talk about. How the story and music are adapted from the Bally Swan Lake, the rumoured trilogy that was planned upon the game's completion, the 30-minute audio drama that's shipped with early copies of the game that explains Bobbin's origins and how the Weavers transitioned from cloth makers to full-on magicians. But to do that I need to talk about the different versions of the game that came out, because my goal with these is to tell you whether a game's worth playing. It's kind of the definition of a review. So if I'm going to recommend this to you, I need to tell you which version of the game you should play. The main three I'm going to focus on here are the original floppy disk release, the FM Towns port, and the PC CD-ROM re-release. Normally you'd think, upgraded graphics and voice acting, CD-ROM wins! Hold your horse, there's more to it than that. Loom had to cut a shit bunch of dialogue when it moved to CD-ROM, because every line of dialogue was voiced and their voice acting was done with a single track of uncompressed audio, limiting them to 80 minutes of digital sound in total. It's the only time I've seen a CD-ROM version that's less verbose than its floppy counterpart. Bear in mind that floppy disks used to have such tiny capacities that the developers had to worry about how much room their text was taking up. On top of that, there's some close-up images that are missing, half the game is devoid of any music or background noise whatsoever, and all of the selected item insets look astoundingly non-VGA. If they were that short on space, I can think of some things that could have been cut instead. Does that mean you should go ahead and grab some copies of those floppies? Depends if you can cope with this level of graphical fidelity. Bear in mind that some people consider the floppy version to be as good as 16-colour EGA graphics ever got. Whilst I never let that put me off Space Quest 3, and I know there's a lot of people that will swear by the original, I know that some people have their limits. I mean, even I was born a little late to fully appreciate this kind of thing. So this leaves the FM Towns version. If you haven't heard of this, then don't be embarrassed, nobody has. The FM Towns is a PC variant mostly popular in Japan and lauded at the time for its multimedia capabilities. You know, back when having a sound card was something of a luxury. The version released for this system lies somewhere in between the other two. VGA graphics and upgraded music, but minus the voice acting and therefore minus all the dialogue cuts that made way for it. The CD-ROM's voice acting isn't bad, but it's not enough for me to shake the feeling that there's something missing when you're playing that version. So that's a full story with old-timey visuals, better graphics and voice acting but a shorter and less fleshed out story, or good graphics, updated music and all the text intact. Yep, I found myself choosing the middle ground. On FM Towns you get VGA prettiness, a nice rendition of the swan-laced soundtrack, and it retains the dialogue lost in the transition to CD-ROM. I've even read that Brian Moriarty, the game's main creator, cites this as the definitive version of the game. Not that all the fans do or should agree with him, but still carries some weight. With my verdict given, the issue of availability pops up. The only legal way to buy this game nowadays is via Steam. That nets you the CD-ROM version, and if that's what you want, then great, job done. You can get the floppy disk version to run in ScumVM too, just in case messing around a DOSBox isn't your thing. But what about the FM Towns release that I recommended about 30 seconds ago? Well, chances are you don't have an FM Towns machine lying around, but there's a way to get that version running in ScumVM, provided you've bought it on Steam. I've tried this out for myself, it works absolutely great. I really don't see a problem with doing this. You've already given them money the only way that's possible, you're just taking a version of that game that they are selling and transforming it into a version that they're never going to put out themselves. And the big question, which I've left a lot later than usual, is this game worth playing? If you're into point-and-click adventures, then yes. There's been innumerable takes on the classic point-and-click adventure interface over the years as the genre matured, but the fact that this plays in such a unique way and bearing in mind how different it was from other titles of the time, that makes it worth a gander. If nothing else, it'll explain all these jokes from The Secret of Monkey Island.